The first shell shattered the crate 2 meters from Senior Lieutenant Alexander Volkov's head. Not a German shell. This was the scream of metal on metal, the catastrophic failure of a cable under immense strain. A 2-ton crate, swung by a weary crane operator, had clipped the side of a ship's hold and disintegrated in midair. Shards of packing wood and straw rained down over the dock. Inside the shattered remains, like the exposed heart of some shattered beast, gleamed the pristine cylinders of American tank engine blocks. They rolled and clattered across the icy cobblestones of Murmansk, coming to rest at the boots of the stunned Soviet tank crew. This was their welcome, not with ceremony, but with the immediate violent language of war that Volkov understood. He didn't flinch. He simply turned his head, his eyes pale and sharp like river ice, tracking the path of destruction, before settling back on the quartermaster. The man hadn't even blinked. This was normal here. This port was a mouth-chewing raw steel and spitting out mangled wreckage. It devoured ships from the convoys and men from the docks with the same indifferent hunger. Volkov was here for a new tank. His T-34, Storozhevoy, Sentry, was a tomb for 2 of his men now, a fused sculpture of blackened metal on a field near Kharkov. He had loved that machine with a furious, painful pride. He knew its every deafening rattle, the precise spot where the gearbox would protest, the way the fumes would mix with the smell of sweat and fear. It was brutally, magnificently simple, an extension of his own will. His new crew followed him through the chaos. Ivan, his driver, a man whose shoulders seemed permanently hunched from squeezing into tank hatches, walked with a slight limp from an old burn. Petrovich, the gunner, young but with ancient eyes, compulsively wiped his hands on his tunic, as if cleaning off non-existent grit from firing handles. Sasha, the radio operator and mechanic, was already squinting at the strange shapes in the shadows, his mind reverse engineering what he saw. The quartermaster, a captain with a clipboard that seemed glued to his hand, stopped before a row of towering, shrouded shapes. They were wrong. Volkov felt it in his gut before the man spoke. They were too tall, their silhouettes against the Arctic gloom not predatory and low like a T-34, but bulky, almost rectangular. A shape that shouted for attention on a battlefield. "Your replacement, Senior Lieutenant. The American M4A2, diesel. They call it Sherman." The captain's tone was flat, administrative. He yanked a tarpaulin back. The thing stood there. It wasn't a tank, not as Volkov knew tanks. It was a fabrication, a construction. The T-34 was born from a single brutal idea: sloped armor. This was an assembly. Welded plates met cast curves in a confusing geometry. The front hull wasn't a single sweeping plane, but a stepped affair, a driver's hatch like a heavy door bolted onto it. And the turret. It sat so high, so proudly atop the hull, a perfect target. A coffin perched on a raft. Ivan let out a sound. Not a word, but a low grunt of pure professional contempt. "A 5-story building for the Germans to see," he muttered, his voice swallowed by the port's din. For a driver, height was death. Volkov approached. He ignored the main hatch. He went to the front, placing a gloved hand on the glacis plate. The steel was cold, but the finish was strangely smooth, almost polished under the grime of travel. It felt alien. His T-34's armor had texture, a rough, honest skin. This was like touching a manufactured appliance. He hauled himself up. The surfaces were different. Angles where he expected curves. Bolts placed with a cold, logical regularity that felt impersonal. He peered into the commander's cupola. and the world inside his head shifted. It was cramped, yes, but it was organized. It was filled. A gyro-stabilized gun sight, a forest of gauges with clean, legible Roman letters and numbers, a proper padded seat with a backrest. He saw not just a gunner's position, but a dedicated station. And the radio. It wasn't an afterthought bolted to the wall. It was a console. For a moment, a treacherous, shameful thought flashed. This is how you design a machine for men to live in, not just to die in. He pushed it down, anger flaring hot to cover the disloyalty. This was bourgeois comfort, decadence. On the Eastern Front, you didn't need a seat. You needed armor and a gun that worked. "It's a bus," Petrovich said, his voice hollow. He was staring at the 75mm gun barrel. It looked right, but everything around it was wrong. Volkov dropped inside the hull, his body moving by instinct through unfamiliar space. The air was thick with a new smell, not the Soviet cocktail of diesel, rust, and human exhaustion. This was the scent of fresh rubber insulation, of pristine hydraulic fluid, of paint that hadn't been baked by the summer sun of the Ukrainian steppe. It was the smell of a factory that had never heard a bomb scream. It smelled of peace. The smell insulted him. Sasha, the radio man, was already tracing wires with a reverent finger, his earlier skepticism replaced by the awe of a technician seeing a revelation. Ivan had squeezed himself into the driver's compartment. His voice echoed, muffled and furious, from the bowels of the machine. "The pedals! They're arranged like a car. And the steering. Levers. Where are my tillers? This is a toy." But Volkov was looking at the ammunition stowage. Racks, neat accessible bins. On the T-34, shells rolled at your feet, a constant, deadly carousel. Here they were catalogued. Then his eyes found the stenciled English words by the main gun breech. A warning. Instructions. He couldn't read them. In his own tank, he was a god, knowing every whim of the machine. Here, he was illiterate. A primitive, staring at a scroll. He climbed out, his face a mask. His crew looked at him, waiting. They saw not curiosity on his face, but a cold, simmering rage. He was not seeing a powerful new weapon. He was seeing a betrayal of everything he had survived. This comfortable, complicated, tall machine was an insult to the memory of Storozhevoy, to the men who had burned in simpler, purer steel. He slapped the turret side. The sound was a dull, hollow clang, not the solid thud of his T-34. "It's not a tank," Volkov said, his voice cutting through the cold air. "It is a delivery truck. They have sent us a mobile coffin. We will learn to drive it. We will learn to fight in it. And we will die in it, because it stands out like a monument. But it is what they gave us. So we will make it ours, even if we have to tear out its American heart and replace it with a Soviet one." He turned his back on the Sherman, looking not at his men, but out at the dark, oily water of the harbor, where the shadows of more ships loomed. He was no longer just a tank commander. He was a prisoner, sentenced to fight a war in a machine he already despised. The first battle would not be against the Germans. It would be against this iron guest, this alien thing that had come to replace his home. The training ground was a vast, frozen expanse of scrub and birch forest, 100 kilometers from the front, but a world away from the port's chaos. Here, under a low white sky, the Sherman was no longer a static spectacle of alien engineering. It was a living, breathing problem, a complex, stubborn, and infuriatingly capable problem. The first lesson was humility. It arrived in the form of a young American technical liaison, Lieutenant James McAllister. He was bundled in a Soviet greatcoat over his own uniform, his face raw from the cold. He didn't speak Russian. They didn't speak English. Communication was a pantomime of gestures, pointed fingers, and the shared, sacred language of machinery. He held a manual, its pages filled with diagrams that were as foreign as the tank itself. Volkov saw it not as a guide, but as an indictment of their ignorance. McAllister's first act was to stop Ivan from starting the engine with a furious, desperate crank. The American gently, too gently for Ivan's pride, showed him the electric starter. A button. Ivan stared at it, his coarse, fuel-stained finger hovering over the small, innocuous switch as if it were a serpent. He pressed it. The twin General Motors diesel engines coughed once, a clean mechanical sound, and then settled into a steady, synchronous purr. The silence that followed inside the hull was profound. No bone-rattling roar, no clouds of black smoke. Just a smooth, industrial hum. It felt wrong, it felt dishonest. A tank should announce its presence with fury. Driving was the next betrayal of Ivan's instincts. The T-34 was driven with two heavy tiller levers. You hauled on them like wrestling a bull, your body translating directly into the machine's violent, skidding turns. The Sherman had a steering wheel. A wheel. Ivan gripped it, his knuckles white, his face a mask of incredulous disgust. He expected failure, a disconnect. But as the tank moved forward, the precision was unnerving. The steering was responsive, light. The vertical volet spring suspension, which they had mocked as fragile, absorbed the frozen ruts and holes with a soft, rocking motion. The T-34 would have crashed through, jolting their spines, rattling their teeth. The Sherman glided. It rode. "Like a bourgeois carriage," Ivan shouted over the intercom, his voice thick with shame. He was being robbed of his struggle, his physical mastery. He felt like a chauffeur. For Petrovich, the gunner, the revelation was visual and tactical. His station was a cave of optics. The main telescopic sight was a window into another world, clear, wide, with precise, graduated markings. On the T-34, aiming was an act of faith and brutal estimation. Here, it was geometry. But the true shock came when McAllister, after a laborious hour of miming, conveyed they should fire on the move. Petrovich laughed, a harsh, short sound. Firing the T-34 on the move was a lottery, the gun barrel leaping wildly with every bump. He traversed the turret, the hydraulic drive whining softly, another alien sound, and laid the reticle on a wrecked truck hull, used as a target. He braced for the violent lurch as Ivan drove over a berm. The lurch came, but the gun barrel didn't leap. It stayed. It wavered, yes, but it remained eerily, impossibly on target. The gyroscopic stabilizer was working. Petrovich fired. The report was sharper, higher pitched than their old gun. Through the sight he saw the round strike the center of the truck's cab. Not a lucky hit, a calculated one. He didn't cheer. He went very quiet. This changed everything. It changed the dance of battle from a wild brawl to a potential duel. For Volkov, the commander, the education was in orchestration. The T-34's interior was a shared, screaming hell where commands were roared and often lost. The Sherman had an intercom, a real one. Every crew member had a headset. He could speak in a near-normal voice. "Driver, left turn. Gunner, target, 2 o'clock. Bunker." The words were executed with a speed and clarity that felt like a superpower. The radio, Sasha's new kingdom, crackled not just with command net traffic, but with the voices of other Sherman crews on the range. They were connected, a web of steel, not isolated islands of rage and fear, but with every advantage came a deeper, more intimate horror. Sasha, exploring the engine bay for the first time during field maintenance, found the filters, the pumps, the routing of wires and hoses. It was logical, accessible. Yet, when a minor hydraulic line on the turret traverse sprang a leak, they discovered their field repair kit was useless. The threads were different. The fittings were American. For 2 hours, as the light died, they stood helpless around their bleeding machine until McAllister arrived with a small, specific box of parts. He fixed it in minutes. The dependency was a cold knot in Volkov's stomach. This tank was not just a weapon. It was a chain linking them to a supply line that stretched across an ocean. Break a unique part, and you became a static pillbox. The final chilling lesson came at dusk. They were practicing a combat drill, buttoned up. Volkov and his cupola spotted a simulated enemy position. "Gunner! Hey! Target, 100 meters, frontal," Petrovich responded. The breech clanged. "Loaded! Fire!" The blast was deafening in the confined space, but it was the aftermath that froze them. A thin, acrid smoke filled the fighting compartment, but it was the smell that was unforgettable. It was the smell of their own T-34 burning, the smell of their own past deaths. The American high-explosive shells used a different propellant. The scent was chemically identical to the German Panzerfaust's shaped charge. Every man in the crew recognized it instantly, the perfume of a kill shot, the last scent of their friends. They sat in stunned silence, gasping in the very aroma of their own nightmares, manufactured now inside their new, safe, comfortable tank. It was a psychological ambush. The machine was betraying them on a level deeper than mechanics. That night, in the freezing barracks, they did not speak of the smooth ride or the miraculous sight. Ivan sharpened a knife with furious, repetitive strokes. Petrovich stared at the wall, seeing only the steady reticle. Sasha sketched wiring diagrams in a notebook, trying to reclaim some sense of ownership. Volkov stood outside, smoking, looking at the dark shape of their Sherman in the motor pool. It was no longer just a coffin, it was a siren. It offered survival through a terrifying new kind of warfare, calculated, connected, precise. It whispered promises of life even as it reeked of death. To accept its gifts meant to betray the brutal, honest truth of the war they knew. To reject them was suicide. The second battle was over. The Sherman had not been mastered, but it had begun to reshape them. And in the quiet of the frozen night, Volkov feared not the German 80mm gun, but the slow, insidious rewiring of his own soul by the humming, efficient machine in the shadows. They named her Surovaya Pravda, severe truth. It was Ivan's idea, spat out one evening with a mixture of irony and defiance. The name wasn't painted on the hull. It was a private pact, etched into their shared understanding of the machine that now dictated their lives. The tank was no longer it. She was a complex entity, a fifth member of the crew with a split personality, one side a savior, the other a traitor. The interior of Surovaya Pravda became their entire world, a steel womb that smelled of cold sweat, gun oil, and that ever-present, haunting scent of American propellant that was a ghost of German anti-tank rounds. Each man's relationship with her was a personal war, fought in inches and seconds. For Ivan the driver, the battle was fought with his hands and a profound sense of emasculation. The steering wheel was his enemy. In the T-34, he had been a centaur, his body's strength directly translated into the machine's movement. He felt every loss of traction in his shoulders, every terrain shift in his spine. The Sherman's wheel was a liar. It was light, responsive, and gave no honest feedback. To master it, he had to unlearn the instincts that had kept him alive. He began to drive not by force, but by a feather-light touch, anticipating turns before the terrain demanded them. He discovered the tank's true secret, her unbelievable pivot. By locking one track and easing power to the other, the massive machine could spin in its own length, a balletic turn impossible for the T-34. The first time he executed it perfectly, avoiding a simulated minefield during an exercise, he felt no triumph. He felt like a traitor to his own past, mourning the brutal simplicity of his old tillers, even as he exploited this new alien grace. Petrovich, the gunner, underwent a silent, psychological metamorphosis. His world shrank to the circle of his telescopic sight. The gyro stabilizer had not just changed tactics, it had rewired his nervous system. His old method, wait for the hull to settle, fire in the brief moment of stability, was now a vestigial reflex he had to suppress. McAllister, through relentless pantomime, drilled a new mantra into him. Track and shoot, track and shoot. He learned to keep the crosshairs glued to a target as Ivan drove over broken ground, a surreal experience of watching the world bounce violently in his peripheral vision, while the center remained eerily, unnervingly still. He began to see the battlefield not as a chaotic storm, but as a series of geometric solutions. Range, lead, deflection. It was cold mathematics. The day he drilled 3 moving target hits in a row from 800 meters, his hands steady, his breathing controlled, he felt a chill. He was no longer a soldier firing a cannon. He was becoming a technician executing calculations. The raw, angry thrill of the shot was being replaced by the sterile satisfaction of a correct answer. For Sasha, the radio man mechanic, Surovaya Pravda was a labyrinth of blessings and curses. His kingdom of wires and wavebands was both a sanctuary and a cage. The radio set was a miracle, granting them a god's-eye view of the battalion's fight. He could hear the crisp commands, the warnings, the panicked calls of others. It made them part of a nervous system. But with this connection came a terrifying responsibility. The static-filled airwaves carried not just orders, but the sounds of death. He was the first to hear the truncated, screaming transmission from a neighboring Sherman, call sign Mollet, cut off by the sizzling roar of an internal fire, the dreaded brew-up. The sound lived in his headphones. He also discovered the machine's hidden fragility. During a deep maintenance check, he found the electrical wiring for the turret traverse routed along the inside of the sponson, directly next to the main ammunition stowage. A single spark? A severed cable? The diagram in his mind was horrific. He didn't tell the others. Instead, he spent a furtive night using insulating tape from a rare American repair kit and a prayer, trying to shield the wires. He was no longer just an operator. He was a nervous system surgeon for a creature whose anatomy he only half understood. And Volkov, the commander, fought his war from the cupola, caught between two realities. His old role as the eyes and the roaring voice was obsolete. The intercom made him a conductor, his commands quiet, precise threads woven into the hum of the machinery. He had more information than ever before, yet felt a new kind of isolation. He missed the shared, screaming chaos of the T-34, where fear was communal and courage was passed through bellows. Here, each man was isolated in his own technical task, connected only by wires. His battlefield awareness was sharper, but his connection to his men's spirit was fading behind a veil of technology. The climax of their internal struggle came not in combat, but in a frozen field during a live-fire coordination exercise with a battalion of T-34 85s. The new Soviet tanks, with their long, powerful guns, roared past the Shermans, their commanders standing tall in hatches, shouting and waving with a familiar, reckless bravado. Volkov watched them, a pang of deep, painful nostalgia hitting him. That was his tribe. That was the uncomplicated rage he understood. Then the exercise began. The T-34s charged, firing on the brief halt, their movement a series of aggressive, shuddering stops and starts. Volkov, using the intercom, directed Ivan along a flanking route. Surovaya Pravda moved like a shark, smooth and relentless. Petrovich, his voice calm in the headphones, called out targets. Traversing, on, steady, firing. The reports were rhythmic, disciplined. They hit every stationary target while moving, a feat the T-34s couldn't match. The Soviet tankers, during the debrief, looked at them with a new, complicated expression. It wasn't camaraderie. It was a mixture of respect and alienation. They were no longer just fellow tankers. They were something else, efficient, strange, detached. That night, sitting in the dim belly of their tank, sharing a can of American pork loaf, the silence was heavy. Ivan finally spoke, staring at his hands. I can drive her. I can make her dance. But I do not feel her heartbeat. Petrovich nodded, not looking up. I see the solution before I see the enemy. Volkov understood. Surovaya Pravda was making them better soldiers and worse warriors. She was carving out their humanity and replacing it with efficient, lethal geometry. She was saving their lives by first killing the men they used to be. The third battle was over. They had learned to fight as a part of the machine. The terrible unspoken question now hanging in the cold air was what would be left of them if, or when, the machine was finally torn away. The front was not a line. It was a landscape of absence and sudden, violent presence. A smoldering village, the charred ribs of houses against the mud-gray sky. The smell was the same as in all of Volkov's memories. Cordite, wet earth, decay, and the cloying, sweet metallic scent of burnt flesh. It was the smell of home. Surovaya Pravda moved through this familiar hell with an alien quiet. Her twin diesels a low murmur against the distant thunder of artillery. She felt like an intruder in a private grief. They were attached to a mixed battalion, a fist of T-34 85s, and a few other Shermans, a tool thrown into a counterattack to plug a rupture in the lines near the Vistula. Their baptism was not a grand charge, but a tense, crawling advance through a shattered forest, the blackened skeletons of pine trees clawing at the sky. Ivan navigated the apocalyptic terrain with his new, delicate touch, the suspension absorbing shattered logs and shell craters with that infuriating, life-saving smoothness. Inside, the world was a cocoon of tense murmurs and the electric smell of ozone from the radios. Volkov, his torso exposed in the cupola, felt the old animal awareness flood back, sharper now, heightened by the crystal clarity of the intercom in his ear. He could hear Petrovich's controlled breathing, Sasha's whispered updates on the battalion net. It was a symphony of preparedness. It felt clinical. It felt wrong for the chaos outside. The first contact was a brutality of fire and noise that stripped away all theory. A German anti-tank gun, hidden in a copse of ruined farm buildings, fired first. The shot was a white-hot crack that missed the lead T-34 by inches, digging a furious scar into the earth. Instinct, older than the Sherman, took over. "Driver, hard left! Reverse!" Volkov barked. Even spun the wheel, not the tillers, and the Sherman pivoted on its axis, sliding behind a berm with a grace no T-34 could manage. In that moment, the machine's alien nature saved them. The second shot passed through the space they had just occupied. What followed was not the brawl, Volkov knew. It was a dissection. The T-34s, with their roaring engines and aggressive lunges, drew the German guns' fire. Volkov, using the intercom, directed Ivan along a shallow depression. "Gunner, Cokes, tracers. Find them." Petrovich, his eye pressed to the miraculous sight, fired a burst from the bow machine gun. The tracer rounds walked through the splintered wood, sparking off stone. He saw a flash, a movement. "Target identified. Hull down 150 meters. Load AP." The clang of the breech was a sacred sound. "Up. Fire." The 75mm gun roared. The recoil was absorbed by the familiar, sturdy hydraulics. Through his periscopes, Volkov saw the explosion of wood and earth, the gun's barrel spinning away, a dark, twisted limb. A clean, surgical kill. No wasted motion. No heroic charge. It was efficient. It was merciless. A cheer started in Volkov's throat but died there. It had felt like a simulation on the range. Then the world changed. The radio crackled with a new, raw panic. A voice from a T-34 commander, a man Volkov knew only by call sign, Grom, Thunder, screamed a word that froze the blood in every Soviet tanker's veins. "Tiger! Direct front! It just killed Stal!" A new shadow entered the battlefield. It emerged from behind a low hill, not with speed, but with an immense, dreadful inevitability. The Panzerkampfwagen 6 Tiger. Its slab-sided, monolithic armor seemed to absorb the dull light. Its long 88mm gun was not a weapon. It was a verdict. Chaos erupted. The T-34s scattered, firing on the move, their rounds sparking harmlessly off the Tiger's frontal hide like lit matches. One T-34, Grom himself, made a desperate flanking dash. The Tiger's turret traversed with a slow, hydraulic menace. It fired. The sound was different, deeper, final. Grom's tank ceased to be a machine and became an instant sun of fuel and ammunition. The turret lifted off, a grotesque tin can opener, and the hull vomited fire. Inside Surovaya Pravda, the shock was a physical blow. They saw their countrymen, their tribe, annihilated with contemptuous ease. The clinical precision of minutes ago curdled into a hot, primal rage. Volkov's mind split. One part, the old T-34 commander, screamed to charge, to close the distance, to die with the fury they had just witnessed. The other part, the new commander shaped by the Sherman's logic, saw the numbers. Their 75mm gun was useless against the Tiger's front at this range. To charge was to join Grom. "Driver back, now! Smoke, now!" The commands were torn from him. Ivan threw the Sherman into reverse, the smooth transmission whining in protest. Sasha fired the smoke grenade launchers. A thick, white curtain billowed around them. The Tiger's second shot tore through the smoke, a ghostly freight train passing meters to their right. They were hiding. The shame was a taste of copper in Volkov's mouth. But they were alive. Through the dissipating smoke, he watched the Tiger methodically stalk another T-34. The Soviet tank was darting, weaving, a display of incredible, doomed bravery. It bought time. 10 seconds. 20. In that borrowed time, the Sherman's different soul spoke to Volkov. Not through rage, but through its geometry. He saw the terrain, a shallow ditch leading to the Tiger's flank. The tiger was focused, a predator locked on prey. Its side armor was a different equation. "Ivan, follow the gully. Do not reverend crawl. Silence is our armor now." The Sherman, for all its faults, had a quiet engine. Ivan eased her forward, the tracks whispering through the mud, using the terrain folds the heavier, cruder T-34 could not. They were not a knight in a duel. They were a thief in the night. It took an eternity. The tiger fired again. Another T-34 died. Petrovich tracked the beast through his sight, his face pale, a single drop of sweat tracing a path through the grime on his temple. "Range 190, steady." He's turning his hull, presenting the flank. The tiger's commander had sensed something, a flicker of movement. The massive turret began its slow swing towards them. "Now!" Volkov roared. Ivan stood on the brakes. The Sherman shuddered to a halt. Petrovich had already laid the reticle on the center of the tiger's side plate, just behind the tracks. The stabilizer held the gun rock steady, firing. The shot was a release of all their tension, their fear, their shame. The armor-piercing round crossed the short distance in a blink. It did not spark. It punched. A clean, dark hole appeared in the German steel. A second later, a jet of fire licked out, then erupted inward as the ammunition cooked off. The tiger heaved, its hatches blew open, and it sat, burning, a king, murdered in its blind spot. There was no cheer. In the sudden, ringing silence, broken only by the crackle of the German tank's funeral pyre, a profound dislocation settled over the crew of Surovaya Pravda. They had won. They had killed a tiger. They had avenged Grom. But they had done it not with the shared, sacrificial fury of the T-34s. They had done it with calculation, with silence, with a technological cheat. They had survived where others, braver in the old way, had died. Volkov looked from the burning tiger to the smoldering wrecks of the T-34s. The Brotherhood of the Eastern Front was forged in shared sacrifice. Their victory felt lonely, a product of a different, colder logic. The Sherman had proven its terrible worth. It had also exiled them, just a little, from the soul of the war they were fighting. They were no longer just Soviet tankers. They were survivors by design, and the weight of that design was heavier than any armor. The victory over the tiger left a hollow aftertaste, a metallic residue of shame that no amount of official congratulations could wash away. Surovaya Pravda bore the scars of the duel, a long, deep gouge across the front glacis plate from a near miss by the tiger's coaxial machine gun and a cracked periscope lens. They were sent to a field repair point, a chaotic clearing in a pine forest that smelled of hot metal, welding arcs, and despair. Here, the broken tools of the offensive were mended or cannibalized. It was here that the true, fragile brotherhood of the Lend-Lease tankers was forged, not in combat, but in the desperate, intimate struggle to keep the machines alive. The repair point was a stark diorama of two industrial cultures colliding. Soviet recovery vehicles, brutal ZIS trucks, and hulking tractors, hauled-in crippled tanks, T-34s with turrets askew, Shermans with track links dangling like torn ligaments. Soviet mechanics, their faces and hands permanently stained black with grease and carbon, worked with a frenetic, almost savage pragmatism. They wielded hammers like extensions of their arms, beat bent metal back into vague shape with a relentless, deafening persistence, and performed field surgeries with cutting torches that screamed blue fury. Their philosophy was born of scarcity. Make it work, now, by any means necessary. Elegance was a corpse on the road to Berlin. And then there was the American contingent. They occupied a corner of the clearing that seemed unnaturally orderly. 2 young U.S. Army engineers, Sergeants Miller and O'Brien, were attached to the repair point. They lived in a trailer that was a shrine to specificity, filled with crates marked with indecipherable stock numbers, cabinets of tools each in its own felt-lined slot, and technical manuals bound in water-resistant canvas. They moved differently. They measured. They consulted schematics under hooded lamps. To the Soviet tankers, they looked like librarians in a butcher shop. The first interaction was a collision of worlds. Ivan, driven by a seething need to fix his own machine and expunge the memory of his dependency, attempted to repair the damaged track tensioner himself. He attacked it with a sledgehammer and a cold chisel, the ringing blows echoing through the clearing. Sergeant O'Brien watched for 2 minutes, his face a mask of growing physical pain. Finally, he stepped forward, not with authority, but with the gentle horror of a watchmaker seeing a brick used to adjust a delicate movement. He didn't shout. He simply placed his own hand on the housing, stopping Ivan's next swing. Ivan glared, expecting a challenge. O'Brien pointed to a specific, sheared bolt. He then walked to his trailer and returned with a precise, strange-looking extractor tool and a tap-and-die set for American fine threads. He handed them to Ivan, mimed the action, and stepped back. Ivan, suspicious, used the tool. The broken bolt yielded with a clean, satisfying turn. The repair that would have taken an hour of brutal improvisation was done in 10 silent minutes. Ivan stared at the tool, then at O'Brien. It wasn't gratitude he felt. It was the disorienting awe of a caveman handed a precision screwdriver. For Sasha, the radio man, the Americans became his secret university. Sergeant Miller, a wiry man with grease under his fingernails, but a mind of crystalline order, saw Sasha's furtive sketches of wiring diagrams. One evening, Miller silently laid the official Sherman electrical schematic on a crate between them. It was a masterpiece of logic, a map of a nervous system. Sasha spent the night cross-referencing it with the actual battlefield-modified guts of their tank, discovering the terrifying junctions where Soviet field repairs had jury-rigged solutions with incompatible wiring, creating ghost shorts and potential death traps. Miller didn't give him answers. He gave him the language to find them. In return, Sasha showed him the Soviet modifications. The extra armor plates welded haphazardly to the hull sides by desperate crews, the internal racks for additional hand grenades, the rerouting of a coolant line away from a vulnerable spot. Miller would nod, take notes, and sometimes a look of horrified understanding would flash across his face. The realization of what his pristine machines were being subjected to. The real alchemy happened over a catastrophic failure. Another Sherman, call sign Mattel, Blizzard, was towed in with a complete transmission seizure. The Soviet senior mechanic, a grizzled veteran missing 2 fingers, declared it a lost cause. A week's work to pull and replace the unit, time they didn't have. The tank would be stripped for parts. The crew of Mattel stood by their silent dead machine, their faces empty with loss. Sergeant Miller studied the diagnosis. He conferred with O'Brien in rapid English. Then he approached the Soviet chief. Using a stick in the mud, he drew not the transmission, but the torque converter housing. He pointed to a small access plate. The Soviet chief scoffed. That was for inspection, not repair, Miller insisted. With nothing to lose, they heaved the tank up on jacks. Using a special wrench from a kit no one had seen before, O'Brien opened the plate. Inside, buried in fluid, was a fractured spring from a tiny pressure valve, a component the Soviets didn't even know existed. It had jammed the entire system. Miller produced a replacement from a small, unmarked box. It took 40 minutes. They closed the plate, refilled the fluid. The chief, his face a storm of disbelief and wounded pride, gestured for the driver to start the engine. The Sherman roared to life, the transmission engaging with a smooth clunk. Mattel was resurrected. The silence that followed was profound. Then, the Soviet chief grunted. He walked to his own stash, pulled out a bottle of brutal home-distilled Samagon, and thrust it into Miller's hands. That night, around a fire made from packing crates, the Brotherhood was sealed not in words, but in shared substances and gestures. The Americans sipped the flammable liquor and coughed, tears in their eyes. The Soviets tasted velvety American chocolate for the first time, the absurd sweetness a shock in their war-hardened mouths. Ivan traded a captured German officer's compass for a robust, American-made multi-tool. O'Brien presented Sasha with a set of color-coded wiring diagrams laminated against the damp. Volkov watched this silent exchange. He saw the wall between our and theirs crumble in the face of shared mechanical truths. The Americans weren't soft. Their softness was an illusion created by the luxury of precision. Their toughness was in the unyielding logic of their systems. The Soviets' toughness was in their refusal to let any system defeat them. Together, in this muddy clearing, they formed a complete organism. One provided the heart's precise rhythm. The other provided the brutal strength of the body to carry it through hell. As Surovaya Pravda drove out of the repair point, her wound healed with a perfectly machined American bolt and a scar of Soviet welding. Volkov understood. The front line was where they fought the enemy. But here, in the kingdom of broken steel, they were fighting a common foe: entropy, decay, the inevitable failure of all machines. And in that fight, nationality bled away, replaced by the shared, sacred identity of those who could will dead metal back to life. The Sherman was no longer an American tank. It was a hybrid, a chimera, its soul a fragile fusion of two worlds kept alive by the wizards in the wreckage. The knowledge from the repair point transformed them. It was a virus of pragmatic heresy that rewired their understanding of their own machine. Surovaya Pravda was no longer a mysterious, capricious guest. She was a known entity, a collection of strengths to be exploited and weaknesses to be viciously protected. They became not just a crew, but a council of engineers plotting the perfect crime of survival. The first evolution was tactical, born from the searing memory of the Tiger's frontal armor. They abandoned the Soviet doctrine of aggressive closure, the glorious head-on charge. The Sherman soul rejected it. Instead, they became ambush predators, apostles of the first shot. They used their smooth, quiet ride to slink into positions no T-34 commander would consider. Reverse slopes, dense thickets, the corpse-littered courtyards of shattered villages. Ivan mastered the art of positioning the hull, so only the turret's mantlet, the thickest part, was exposed. He could make the tank crouch. Petrovich's transformation was the most profound. He ceased to be a gunner in the Red Army sense. He became a sniper. He compiled mental dossiers on German armor, the flat, vulnerable side of a Panzer IV's turret, the delicate drive wheel of a Stug 3 assault gun, the thin rear plate of a Panther, a secret whispered to him by a captured schematic Miller had shown him. He knew the precise ballistics of their American shells. He would wait, his eye a pale blue stone behind the lens, his breathing so slow it seemed suspended. He waited for the enemy to present the exact geometric solution he required. He did not fire at tanks. He fired at weak points. He fired at fuel tanks. He fired at track links. His kills were not explosions of cataclysmic fire, but crippling blows. A vehicle immobilized, burning slowly, its crew bailing out under a storm of Koch's machine gun fire from Sasha's station. It was efficient. It was mercilessly clinical. It stripped the romance from the kill. Volkov's command adapted to this new, cold liturgy. His orders were no longer shouts of encouragement, but coordinates and conditions. Gunner, Panzer IV, hull down at the tree line. Wait for his turn. Aim for the lower side hull, behind the bogies. Driver, be ready to reverse on my mark. The battlefield in his mind was a three-dimensional chessboard of angles, penetration values, and escape routes. He learned to love the Sherman's fast turret traverse, a feature he'd once scorned as frivolous. It allowed them to engage multiple threats in a staccato rhythm of death. Fire at an anti-tank gun. Traverse. Fire at an infantry squad. Pivot. Retreat. They fought in a blur of controlled, lethal motion. But this mastery came at a terrible cost to their own identity. They began to view the T-34 battalions, their own countrymen, with a detached, analytical pity. They watched a heroic, wasteful charge across open ground, the 34s advancing with thunderous courage, and saw not glory, but a flawed equation. They saw vulnerable side armor, predictable pauses to fire. They saw waste. When a T-34 brewed up, Volkov's first thought was no longer a pang of grief for the men, but a cold assessment. Wrong approach angle. Should have used the gully. The crew's internal language changed. They spoke less of the enemy and more of the machine's components. The left final drive is running hot, Ivan would say, his ear tuned to a pitch only he could hear. The stabilizer is drifting a fraction to the right under recoil, Petrovich would note, his voice devoid of emotion. They were becoming cyborgs, their human senses fused to the Sherman's mechanical feedback. The crisis of this unbecoming arrived during the assault on a fortified town. Their battalion was ordered to support infantry clearing a network of streets. For the T-34s, it was a close-quarters brawl, a brutal hammering of buildings at point-blank range. Surovaya Pravda was assigned a supporting role, providing overwatch from the town's edge. From his perch, Volkov had a panoramic view of the chaos. He saw a T-34, call sign Yari, fierce, get trapped in a narrow street. A hidden Panzerfaust team fired from a second-story window. The rocket struck the engine deck. Yari did not explode immediately. It stalled, belching black smoke, a wounded animal. The crew began to bail out, scrambling from the hatches. German infantry in a nearby cellar opened up with a machine gun, cutting them down on the cobblestones. The old Volkov, the T-34 commander, would have screamed in rage, ordered a charge into that street to extract or avenge his comrades. Consequences be damned. It was the unspoken law of the front. The new Volkov, the commander of Surovaya Pravda, did not. His mind processed the scene with terrifying clarity. Charging into that narrow street was suicide. The Panzerfaust team was still active. The infantry nest was entrenched. His Sherman's height made it an even easier target in confined spaces. The men from Yari were already dead. The equation was clear. Gunner, building, second floor, third window from the left. He, fire. Petrovich, his face impassive, traversed, aimed, fired. The shell blew the wall and the Panzerfaust team into dust. Coax, cellar aperture, suppress. Sasha hosed the cellar opening with the machine gun. They provided covering fire, allowing other infantry to advance. It was the tactically perfect decision. It was a betrayal of the warrior's code. They did not move an inch to recover the bodies. Later, during a lull, Ivan finally spoke, his voice hollow. "We could have tried, for the bodies." Petrovich, still cleaning his sight lens, said without looking up, "We would have joined them. The shot was 90% probable." Volkov said nothing. He just stared at his hands. They were clean. In the T-34, after a fight, they were always black with grime, with shared effort. Now he gave clean orders that resulted in clean kills from a distance. The moral grime was internal, invisible. The Sherman had perfected them. It had sharpened them into the ultimate instrument of war. In doing so, it had systematically dismantled the very thing that had made them Soviet soldiers. The furious, sacrificial human bond that valued vengeance and brotherhood above pure survival. They were alive. They were effective. They were, in the eyes of the High Command, exemplary. But as they sat in their efficient, humming steel coffin, the smoke of the burning Yeri staining the horizon, they felt a loss more profound than any battlefield defeat. They were winning the war, and in the process, becoming strangers to the men they were supposed to be. The unbecoming was complete. They were now something else entirely, and they were terrified of what they had gained and what they had left behind forever in that narrow street. The price for their clinical perfection arrived not with a scream, but with a whisper. It was a spring morning, thick with the smell of wet earth and thawing decay. The ground, previously iron-hard, had turned into a clinging, sucking bog. Rasputitsa, the time without roads. For the T-34s with their wide tracks, it was a hindrance. For the Sherman, with its higher ground pressure and intricate suspension, it was a sly, pervasive enemy. They were the spearhead of a probing attack, a role they had earned through their ruthless efficiency. The terrain was a nightmarish quilt of wooded patches and open waterlogged fields. Surovaya Pravda moved with a new cautious rhythm, Ivan wrestling the wheel not against ruts, but against the insistent, hungry mud. The smooth ride was gone, replaced by a labored, squelching progress. The tank felt heavy, burdened, her mechanical advantages neutralized by the primordial soup of the Eastern Front. The ambush was a masterpiece of German timing, executed at the moment of their maximum vulnerability. From a concealed position in a tree line, 200 meters ahead, a well-camouflaged Jagdpanzer IV tank destroyer fired. It was a flat, fast weapon, its low silhouette invisible until the muzzle flash. The shell did not strike with a deafening, penetrative crack. It was a lower, more visceral thump-wang, a sound of a giant being punched in the gut. It hit the Sherman's lower front hull, right of the driver's position, a spot where the armor was thin and, more critically, where the complex final drive and steering unit lived. The impact was a seismic event inside the hull. The world became a deafening, blinding concussion of sheared metal. The hull jerked violently, slewing sideways in the mud. All internal lights died, plunging them into a darkness reeking of hot metal, cordite, and the sharp, terrifying smell of electrical fire. The familiar hum of the engines stuttered and died, replaced by a sickening final silence, broken only by the hiss of escaping fluids and the faint, distant crackle of small flames. For a second there was only shock, a total sensory void. Then training, the cold, drilled-in protocol from 100 exercises, took over. But it was a different kind of training. Not the brawler's instinct of the T-34, but the emergency procedure of the Sherman crew. "Report!" Volkov's voice was a ragged bark in the darkness. The intercom, miraculously, still had power from the backup. "Driver, pinned, my leg, no power. Hydraulic lines gone." Ivan's voice was a tight gasp of pain. "Gunner, intact, optics cracked, electrical fire, panel 3. Petrovich's report was automatic, detached, even as he fumbled for an extinguisher. "Radio, out, main battery severed. Fire spreading to wiring conduit." Sasha's voice was the most desperate. He could see his kingdom of circuits burning. They were not brewing up. Not yet. The American diesel, not gasoline, saved them from an instant inferno. But they were crippled, bleeding out their fluids into the mud, filling with toxic smoke. And the German tank destroyer was still out there, reloading. This was the moment the Sherman, their 5th crew member, died. The machine that had reshaped them, protected them, and alienated them had reached its mechanical limit. Her soul, the synergy of optics, hydraulics, electricity, and smooth power, was extinguished. What remained was a 30-ton steel coffin settling into the muck. The old war, the war of the T-34, came rushing back in through the hatches. It was the war of flesh and blood against steel. Volkov threw open his cupola hatch, gulping in the cold, smoke-free air. He saw the situation with brutal clarity. They were stuck, exposed. The Jagdpanzer's second shot would finish them. Their only chance was the very human sacrificial bravery their Sherman had taught them to transcend. "Abandon! Now! Go, go, go!" He didn't wait. He dropped down inside, grabbing Ivan under the arms. Petrovich and Sasha were already there, ignoring the burning wires, the hot oil spraying from a ruptured line. The driver's compartment was a tangle of bent metal. Ivan's left leg was trapped between a collapsed brake pedal assembly and the hull wall. There were no tools. There was no time for elegant extraction. Sasha, the technician, became a savage. He found a broken track pin, a heavy steel bar. He jammed it into the gap and heaved, not with precision, but with a raw, screaming animal strength born of terror and brotherhood. Metal shrieked, giving way an inch. Petrovich added his weight. Volkov pulled. With a wet, sickening sound of tearing fabric and scraping metal, Ivan came free, his leg bent at a wrong angle. They hauled him out through the driver's hatch, tumbling into the freezing, knee-deep mud. The world outside was a cacophony of machine gun fire and explosions. Other Soviet tanks were engaging, covering them. They dragged Ivan, a 3-man, 6-legged creature of mud and desperation, away from the stricken Sherman. They made it 10 meters, 20, before the second German shell arrived. It struck Surovaya Pravda in the side, igniting the remaining fuel and a portion of the ammunition. The explosion was not the volcanic brew-up of a gasoline tank. It was a fierce, consuming furnace that blew the hatches open and turned her interior into a forge. The machine that had been their home, their advantage, their curse, was now a public funeral pyre on the field. They collapsed in a shell crater, panting, covered in mud and Ivan's blood. The clinical detachment was utterly burned away, scorched off them in the heat of the loss. Petrovich was sobbing, great heaving breaths, not from fear, but from grief. For the tank, for their shattered invincibility. Sasha was mechanically checking Ivan's leg, his clever hands now just hands trembling. Volkov stared back at the burning wreck. He did not see a failed tool. He saw a fallen comrade. He felt a loss as acute as losing a man from his old T-34 crew. The anger, the resentment, the cold calculation, all of it, was consumed in those flames. What remained was a simple human truth. She had kept them alive as long as she could, and in her death she had forced them to remember how to be human again, to fight, not with circuits, but with bare hands, and a screaming will to save one another. The Sherman was dead. The fifth crew member was gone. And in the muddy crater, as the battle raged around them, the 4 surviving men, stripped of their technological armor, began the painful, bloody process of remembering who they were without her. The field hospital was a world of white gauze, the smell of antiseptic, and muted agony. Ivan's leg was saved, but it would never again dance on the pedals of a tank. He was given a medical discharge and a pair of crutches that seemed to him a crueler sentence than death. They said goodbye in a tent, thick with the silence of endings. No words were adequate. Ivan gripped Volkov's hand, his eyes not on his commander's face, but somewhere distant, already lost in a future where he was just a man, no longer part of a machine. It was the first irreparable fracture of their family. Volkov, Petrovich, and Sasha were reassigned. Not to the rear, not to training. The war had its own ruthless logic for veterans. They were given a new tank. Another Sherman, fresh from a stateside factory, pristine in its olive drab paint, smelling of fresh grease and impersonal newness. Its serial number was different. Its fittings were slightly updated. It was nameless. They stood before it on a muddy staging ground, the sounds of the front a constant rumble to the west. The sight of it was a physical blow. It was a ghost, a doppelganger of their dead Surovaya Pravda. Petrovich turned his back, lighting a cigarette with hands that shook. Sasha walked a slow circle around it, his eyes not those of a technician exploring a wonder, but of a gravedigger inspecting an open coffin. Volkov felt a cold, hard knot form in his chest. This was not a replacement. It was an insult. They boarded the new tank in a grim, funereal silence. The interior was a mockery of their loss. Everything was in its place, untouched, unlived in. The seats had no impressions of their bodies. The handles showed no wear from their grips. The radio was a sterile unit, not Sasha's lovingly modified nerve center. It was a shell, waiting for ghosts to inhabit it. The first drive was a hollow pantomime. Ivan's absence was a deafening void. The new driver, a young kid from Siberia with fearful eyes, handled the wheel with clumsy reverence. He did not understand the machine's whispers, her grudges, her capabilities. He just drove it. Petrovich sat at his gunner's station, staring through the pristine sight with dead eyes. He did not see geometry. He saw the burning wreck of their old tank superimposed on the landscape. His legendary patience was gone, replaced by a jittery, aggressive need to fire, to make this alien machine prove its worth immediately, to spill blood to justify its existence. They were a crew of strangers bound by shared trauma, encased in a monument to their loss. Their efficiency was gone. Their coordination was broken. In their first minor skirmish, a confused engagement with a German rearguard, they fumbled. The new driver overcorrected. Petrovich fired too early, wasting a shot. Sasha, trying to manage both the unfamiliar radio and the bow machine gun, missed an infantry squad. They survived only because the Germans were retreating. The magic was broken. The Sherman, without the soul they had forged into the first one, was just a machine, and they were just men, broken by grief. The turning point came not in battle, but in a quiet moment of defeat. The new Sherman developed an electrical fault, a short in the turret power circuit. The young driver panicked. Petrovich cursed, beating his fist against the breach in impotent rage. Sasha climbed into the hull, his face pale. He traced the wiring, his fingers moving over the unfamiliar, pristine bundles. And then he stopped. He saw it. The wiring loom was routed exactly as it had been in Surovaya Pravda, and exactly as in the schematic Sergeant Miller had given him. The flaw was identical, a potential he had learned to mitigate a lifetime ago. In that moment, Sasha did not see a new tank. He saw an inheritance. He saw the ghost of Surovaya Pravda, not in the steel, but in the knowledge they carried. He pulled the laminated, color-coded diagrams from his tunic, creased, stained, but preserved. He showed the new driver the access panel. He guided Petrovich's hands to the backup manual override. He did not just fix the tank. He began to teach. He began to transfer the soul. It was a slow, painful resurrection. Volkov, watching from his cupola, understood. The machine was not their brother. They were the soul. The Sherman was just a vessel. The knowledge from the American engineers, the brutal adaptations from the Soviet mechanics, the hard-won tactical heresies, the memory of Ivan's sacrifice, all of it lived in them. This new empty hull was not a replacement for Surovaya Pravda. It was her successor. A blank page upon which they would write their story again. They did not give it a grand, defiant name. It became simply Dvoinik, the double, the twin. Not out of love, but out of acknowledgement. A vessel for their ghosts. The final test came weeks later during the crossing of the Oder. The battlefield was a storm of steel. Dvoinik moved with a renewed, if more somber, purpose. The new driver had learned from Ivan's ghost, through Sasha's patient instruction. He could feel the tank now. Petrovich's hands were steady again on the controls. His vengeance cooled into a cold, familiar precision. Volkov's commands were clear, weaving their movements into the larger tapestry of the assault. As they pushed forward, they passed a battalion of brand-new T-34 85s, churning up the earth in a glorious, thunderous charge. The Soviet commanders waved from their hatches. Volkov looked at them. He felt no superiority, no pity, no alienation. He felt a profound, quiet kinship. They were all instruments of the same terrible will. Their tools were different, their paths divergent, but the destination and the cost was the same. He dropped down inside Dvoinik. The air smelled of their sweat, their fear, their determination. It smelled of home. He looked at Petrovich at his sight, at Sasha at his radio, at the new driver's tense back. They were not the crew they had been. They were survivors. They were inheritors. The war would end. They would park Dvoinik in a line of other silent machines, American and Soviet, their engines cold. But the fusion was complete. The Brotherhood was not between man and machine, but between the fragments of two worlds that had been hammered together in the crucible of necessity, carried now in the minds and hearts of the men who had lived it. They had not just operated a Lend-Lease tank. They had become the living, breathing, permanent repository of its secret, hybrid soul. A soul forged in Arctic ports, in muddy repair points, in the white-hot grief of a burning field, destined to outlive the steel that had carried it.